In the market's heart, 'neath banners torn like old sails, they called him a monster, a beast with a broken shadow and the silence of storms. Hast thou seen such a thing? A flank stitched with moonlight scars, an eye like a coal that remembers flame, a chain that sang when men pulled too hard? The auctioneer spat the name, and the crowd spat their fear. Hands pointed, tongues wagged, and a child's breath fogged the dusk as if the world had taken a small exhale and held it. What monster dwelleth behind those ribs, if not fear made flesh? Yet see, one small hand, knuckles raw from cold and work, reaches like a moth toward that dark forehead. Who is the daring boy who would touch what all others shun? What secret hides beneath the horse's silence, and what memory will that touch unloose? The crowd leans away. The chain groans. The boy's palm presses to hair that has known hard hands and harder days. A hush as if the very air waited for an answer. But will the horse answer with fire, or with a whisper that unbinds a past none remembered to fear? And if the answer is not what men expected, what shall the men do with their knives and their names? The bell clatters, the world tilts, and a simple touch promises a change that none could have foreseen. Yet who among them thought a monster might be only a story waiting for a child's unafraid hand? And what then shall be revealed when eyes that have only known chains find a touch that asks for nothing in return? Rowan had learned the language of small stubborn things, how the cork bark split at the first frost, how a nail left in a boot will find its way to the soul on the longest march, how grief takes the shape of habit and sits quietly at the hearth. He was no prince nor man of title. The town called him a farmer's son, and the world had taught him to be careful with his handfuls of trust. In the mornings he rose before the sun to mend fences that sagged like old promises, and at night he lay with hands that still smelled of sap and soot, listening to the house breathe. He kept small oaths, a ribbon tied to his wrist for his mother's peace, a coin hidden under floorboard 7 for weathered needs, a silver sliver of a locket that he fingered when sleep would not come. These things told his days more truly than any proud speech. There was a hollow in him that he did not show. It was not the sudden noisy grief of a shipwreck, but the patient ache of a loss that learns one's handwriting. Once, not long before the winter when their town learned to barter fear, a man with a steady hand and a laugh like warm bread had ridden down their lane. That man walked the fields with the boy and showed him how the horses leaned like living maps, how they read the weight of a man and answer in footfall. That man taught Rowan the names of constellations that horses used to find pasture in a new world. Then the man rode away to a storm that left no letter. Rowan's fingers sometimes searched the air for the shape of that hand. Sometimes they rested upon his pulse as if counting a number that would never again be right. The auction came like winter's first crow, sharp, sudden, and dressed in a dozen merchant cloaks. Men and women gathered with their purses and their prejudices. Some had come for plow beasts, some for sale of fancy, and some, the cruel and the watchful, for sport. The vendor stalls smelt of hay and horse sweat and oil. The auctioneer raised his voice as one might lift a plank to hide a hole. The words he offered were currency, and he spent them like coin. At the center, chained and narrow-eyed, stood the beast that the town would soon call monster, a horse whose ribs told of hunger, whose flanks wore stitches, whose mane had once been braided with a child's ribbon and was now a tangle of storm wisps. No placard offered a name. Men like to buy things that come without story, for a blank is easier to own. But small signs were there if one knew to look. A half-gnawed leather strap with a rusted brass clasp, a faded tag with one letter scarred into it, and a thin white thread braided into an old forelock, a child's habit that had clung to its neck like a memory. The crowd laughed at the chain and called for drink. The merchant hawked the animal as worthless or dangerous, words as sharp as iron. They liked the sound of danger. It made their hearth lights seem brighter. Rowan did not laugh. He watched the horse as one studies a closed book by the edge of its cover. His hands, small and used, were not quick with coin. He had no guild, no claim, no purse heavy enough to make men look different. What he had was a lean patience and the memory of a hand that had once steadied him. He had no right to pity, only the right to act on the thing his heart chose. When the auctioneer's hammer rattled like a gavel in a god's sleep, eyes turned and weighed the boy himself, curious at how a small thing might break the rules by merely choosing. Then was the bargain that the world often forgets, a child's conviction versus a town's opinion. Rowan's ordinary world, mending fences, tending embers, counting the narrow days, would not survive untouched if he reached beyond his coin and toward that chained forehead. The warm bred laugh of the man who had ridden away lay like a promise in Rowan's chest, and the horse's tucked head offered a place to touch it. He did not yet know that in the braid of that forelock and in the rusted letter upon the halter lay the map that would lead him from ordinary towards something that would demand a reckoning. He only knew, as boys will know, that when a living thing makes a sound like a question, he must try to answer. They bade for the beast with jeers and with promises of iron. The bids came like small flurries, rejected and drying in the eyes of men. Rowan whispered to himself words he had learned from the fields. Be steady as furrow, slow as thaw. He moved closer, each step a sermon in courage, and reached his hand through the crowd where 100 judgments tried to eclipse his touch. There was a scent on the horse, not only hay but old smoke and salt and something like a song half sung in a storm. The boy's fingers trembled and found the curve of bone beneath the coarse hair. The horse's ear flicked like a sail. Monster, said a man with a scar on his jaw that had long since made him frightening whenever he smiled. Bring iron, bring the rope. We'll not have trouble in our streets. Others called for chains to be tightened. Fear has a taste that makes men greedy for more of it. The auctioneer, smelling the heat of the crowd, raised the price and the laughter. Yet when Rowan slipped a single coin, a coin he had saved for new plowstones, into the flat palm of a quiet buyer who would look no further, he bound himself to a decision. He had not the right to buy, but he had the right to try. Late that night, when the town had drunk itself into a sleeping stupor and the moon kept her pale watch, Rowan slipped to the lot. The horse stood with his ribs a serried map, eyes like coals that remembered fire and did not trust it. Chains clinked in the wind. Rowan had found a bribe in his pocket, a scrap of bread, a memory of childhood. He held it like an offering and waited. He spoke not with the loud tongues of those who command, but in the low, rust-soft syllables that the old man once taught him. Easy, he murmured. Easy, beast. The horse turned his head, nostrils lifting like twin bells, and the boy saw close as truth the depth of fear that had housed itself behind those lashes. The first attempts at companionship were a slow, wrong-angled dance. Rowan tossed the bread. The horse snatched it as though a wolf might steal it at the next breath. His ears went back, then forward. He stamped once as if measuring whether to flee or to stay. Rowan learned the horse's language in fits and starts, the tilt of the head that meant caution, the quick pull of a lip that meant hunger, the soft blow of air that meant thinking. At moments the horse relaxed, a heavy sigh like a tide that had remembered a shore. At other times his muscles tightened, a human shape of history visible behind each twitch. Rowan's palms were calloused. They knew the honest press of work and the careful weight of guilt. He touched the horse's neck and felt the animal's breath, hot, steady, threaded with the scent of hay and old wounds. A rival appeared then, in the shape of a man who kept his teeth like a collection of knives. Mr. Hawk was a buyer of means and of cruel amusements, the sort who took pleasure in proving a living thing's stubbornness with a rope. He had watched Rowan more curiously than contemptuously. Small courage is a rarity that will arrest those who dine on certainty. Boy, Hawk said with the casualness of a man who believes himself a season, this beast will break thee. Best leave it to men who know steel. He clicked his tongue as if to call a dog. Rowan's jaw set like a plowshare. The boy had no fine words, only that quietness which is sometimes the truest reply. He answered by returning each stolen glance to the horse and by speaking softer, as though his voice could stitch trust where iron had made rent. They tried bargaining with mercy. When that failed, they tried to bargain with law. A town magistrate, a man with a ledger and a cold pen, remembered decrees that described beasts of danger, and he murmured sentences that smelled like paper and death. A petition rose like a low-gathering wind. The horse should be sent beyond town, where the men with nets and sharp words would make sure nothing dangerous walked their streets. Rowan felt the net close like frost upon fruit. He had but hours, perhaps minutes, to be more than a boy. He chose instead to be a hand. He spent his pocket coin on a worn halter whose brass bore a faint, almost erased stamp, the letter M. That mark, a scar of commerce, a trace of ownership, shone like a small clue. Rowan threaded the halter through trembling fingers and fastened it like a promise. The horse watched with an unreadable intelligence. Rowan's nights became a litany of tries. He would bring water and the horse would not drink until the boy lay his own cheek upon the trough and let the animal see the pulse that matched the river's. He would whisper the old man's constellation names. The horse would snort as if recognizing a lamp in fog. Sometimes, when the auction lot was empty and the moon held the sky like a great white cloth, the horse would inch nearer. His nostrils would quiver, searching for scent maps. His ears would point to the boy's voice. And once he lowered his head to nudge the boy's palm with the huge, clumsy gentleness of a thing too large to be trusted by men. Rowan felt the weight of the head, the small tremor of a neck that had known fear. It was a gesture like an offering and like a plea. But trust, once betrayed by the battering of men, is slow to mend. The horse flinched at sudden movement as if every quick breath were a whip. He balked at bridles, for ropes had meant only control and pain. He sometimes broke into wild runs in his sleep, hooves shearing the straw like a storm. Each small victory blossomed into a fresh test. Word spread that a boy tended the monster, and with rumor came danger. Some brought stones, sneered, and spat, thinking cruelty a spectacle. Others came with kind words, but soft hands do not mend a heart shaped by hard ones. They can only show another path for the animal to choose, and the animal must choose. On a night when rain braided the gutters and the sky was a lung filled with water, Rowan found a new clue that made his hands cold. Beneath the horse's coarse mane, half hidden by dried sweat and grit, lay a brand, faint, but the shape of a crest he had once traced in his father's old chest, a single cruel letter M intertwined with an arrow. The recognition struck like a bell. The locket at his chest, heavy and secret, warmed in his palm as if some small fire had taken hold. A memory unspooled, a laugh, a stable door slamming, a man's voice calling a horse by a name Rowan had only heard in hushes. Morrow's March. The town's stories had called this beast monstrous, but the brand named him. Rowan's stomach tightened with a fear that was not his own. Other names crowded at the edges of his mind like wolves scenting a change. He sought the man who had sold the horse at the auction, a wiry dealer whose smile was a map of small lies. The dealer blinked and offered excuses like cracked coins. Found him on the moor, he said. Ran wild. No owner, no use. But the brand, the halter, and the boy's memory pushed against the lies. Rowan's heart pounded like a hammer upon an anvil. Each stroke birthed a new question. Who had once owned this horse? Why had he been left to such ruin? And what had become of the man whose laugh Rowan remembered? The questions multiplied, and with them, the stakes. If the horse belonged to someone Rowan loved, then saving him would be saving a part of what had been lost. If the horse bore a secret that men would kill to keep, then touching its forehead could be the very thing that sent hunters to the boy's door. Rowan's fingers found the small locket beneath his shirt. He had kept it like a heartbeat, private and steady. He considered the silver, the face he had pressed to it in lonely hours, and he felt in some cruel way that the horse's brand was a step toward naming a wound he had not yet admitted. The town had already labeled the beast with a terror that made the men bold. Now Rowan smelled the metallic note of history, old enough to rouse the sleeping dogs of the past. He tightened the halter, feeling its weight as if it were the weight of a choice. The storm's thunder rolled like a great drum. The auction lot became a stage for decisions that could not be undone. At the edge of the lot, Mr. Hawk's shadow lengthened like a promise of trouble. He had watched the brand with a look that tasted of hunger. A branded beast, he said, low and slow. Such things are trouble. They carry debts. The magistrate's men, who like lists and paper, muttered of laws and the tidy removal of risk. Rowan heard their words with the ears of a boy who has heard too many doors close. He could not buy the beast outright. He could not claim ownership by coin, but he could act with a different kind of currency. Courage, stubbornness, and the single, foolish thing a child will do when the world demands more than it can offer. He could touch. So it was, under thunder and with rain like truth upon both, that Rowan climbed the low fence and reached for the horse's forehead. The hair was slick with rain and the skin beneath was as warm as any human's, trembling with a life that had not yet given up. For an instant all sound withdrew. The trees held, the rain paused as if listening. The boy's palm laid upon that broad scarred brow and his thumb brushed the faint nick above the eye where the brand's shadow met old wound. The horse's cold dark gaze fixed upon the touch. Something moved in that dark, something vast and old and not meant for auctioneers' ledgers. A sound rose, first small, then folding into the air like a bell curved in sorrow. It was no neigh of fury. It was a low, deep calling, a note that threaded through Rowan's bones and tugged at the locket beneath his shirt, as if the two were parts of the same broken map. Then, the horse's head bowed with a weight that was entire, like a man kneeling before an old fate. Rowan's hand tightened without thought, not of ownership but of recognition. The brand at the horse's flank seemed to flare in the wet light. From the crowd a hush fell that was not of boredom but of sudden frightened listening. Men shuffled. Hawk's voice, which had been a threat, stuck like a twig in his throat. For a moment, as brief as the blink of a lantern, the air tasted of possibility and of peril both. Rowan's heart hammered. The locket grew warm as if replying. The horse breathed on the boy's fingers, hot and sweet with the scent of hay and smoke and old storms. Then a ripple passed through the beast, a shudder that felt not only like fear but like remembering. Something in the horse's eyes cleared, or else Rowan's vision shifted. He could not tell which. A name hummed at the edges of his mind, a single syllable that had been spoken into his childhood like a secret. Rowan leaned closer, the rain slick upon his cheek, and in the hush a voice from the crowd and perhaps the very wind where he called, "Morrow's march?" The question hung trembling. The boy's hand did not move. He had touched the forehead of a supposed monster and found something that might be a memory. The moment stretched thin as glass. Then from the lot's shadow a sharp cry. The magistrate's men rushing, Hawk cursing, a net flung like a heavy argument. Rowan's palm, still upon that warm, scarred brow, felt the first true weight of consequence. He had not only touched a forehead, he had knocked upon a locked door, and the town's wolves had heard the sound. The horse drew back, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with a fear that now mingled with something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the dread of a name remembered. Rowan's breath failed, and the world around him snapped into motion. Ropes, orders, the clang of a cuff. He had reached for what his heart had lost, and in doing so had lit a lantern in a place where men preferred darkness. As hands reached for the horse and for Rowan, the boy felt the locket burn against his palm. He understood with a clarity like winter that to touch was to summon. The touch that changed would not be a quiet thing. It would call old debts, old owners, old violence. The horse's head came up, and with it a sound, neither a snort nor a whinny, but a single long note that seemed to name both memory and warning. And in that sound, in that instant, Rowan saw a face from his past, a man whose laugh was warm bread, silhouetted as if through a veil. The crowd leaned in, men reached, boots shifted, and the rain began again, harder, as if washing the world for what was to come. Thus ended the first part of his choosing, and thus began the clock whose hands would not turn back. The net flew as if cast by fate herself, heavy as guilt, wide as law. Rowan's arms flung upward, instinct tugging him toward the horse's eye, but the rope's shadow stole the stars from above. Yet the beast, branded, scarred, scorned, did not rear as men had always foretold. Instead he surged forward, hooves cracking the boards beneath, chain clattering like 1,000 broken vows. He caught the net in his chest and tore it as thunder rends a hill. Splinters and curses scattered into rain. Rowan stumbled, his palm still burning from the forehead's touch, yet the horse bent his head low, sweeping the boy aside as if to shield him with his bulk. In that instant Rowan felt it, not fury but a vow, that no hand, rope, or iron would reach the child without first crossing the storm contained in that chest. Hawk roared. The magistrate's men pressed in with poles and hooks. Their boots sloshed in the mud. Their breath made the night smell of iron and ale. "Down the beast!" cried one, "before he breaks the town," cried another. Fear swelled them large. Men always grow when shadows lend them courage. Rowan's voice cracked the din, a small reed against thunder. "He is not monster," he cried, his hands raised, his face streaked with rain. "He is March, Morrow's march." At that name the horse snorted long and low, ears flicking back, then forward, then still. Recognition kindled in his dark eye. The word struck him like a bell long silent. He lowered his muzzle, almost brushing Rowan's shoulder, and gave a sound not of rage but of return. A deep rumble, like earth answering the rain. The crowd hesitated. In their eyes flitted unease. That name, that tone, it smelled of story. Hawk alone spat. A beast by any name breaks all the same. He swung his whip, its crack a serpent in the night. But March, yes, March, leapt. Not upward, not wild, but forward past the whip toward the pole that threatened the boy. His teeth clamped the wood and shattered it in two, splinters exploding like sparks. Men fell back, pale and breathless. In that gap of terror, Rowan pressed both palms upon the scarred forehead. "March," he whispered, steady now, like speaking to the very heart of the storm. "Remember me," and the horse stilled. From trembling flanks to pounding hooves, stillness grew as dawn grows on frost. His head bowed again, not to chains but to choice. Rowan's hand slid to the damp mane, fingers twining into the thread of old braid still hidden there. He tugged gently and March followed. Not dragged, not driven, followed. The sight held the crowd as if they stood before miracle and gallows both. For in that act the monster had chosen not the mob nor the whip but the boy, and so the boy in turn was no longer child, but something the town would reckon with, the keeper of a vow older than law. A crack of thunder split the sky, the storm's drum answering the climax below. Men stumbled, women gasped, the magistrate's ledger soaked and tore in his hand. Rowan led March one step, then two, into the open square, rain streaking his face like tears. Each step was a refusal, of fear, of cruelty, of the name monster. "Behold," cried Rowan, his small voice filled by storm. "He walks with me." The square fell silent save for thunder, rain, and the deep, steady breath of a horse who had remembered himself. The magistrate, drenched and trembling, dropped his broken ledger. This cannot stand," he stammered, though his voice lacked iron. The law is blind when the heart is open," Rowan answered, his tone far older than his years. He stroked March's muzzle, water dripping from mane and boy alike. Hawk snarled, whip limp in his hand. "Keep him then, and may he tear thee apart." He turned away, but the bitterness in his eyes promised return. Some debts once denied are only buried shallow, yet the rest of the crowd did not follow Hawk. They watched in uneasy awe as Rowan led March toward the trough, unchained now, the halter loose but chosen. The horse drank deep, each swallow echoing in the hearts of those who had only seen him chained. The boy leaned against the broad shoulder, small as a leaf against an oak, and did not tremble. Whispers began. Perhaps not monster. Perhaps once he was noble stock. Perhaps the lad has tamed him. Stories breed quicker than weeds when rain softens the ground. By morning some would tell that they themselves had seen the beast bow. Others would swear they had heard him speak with the boy in words not human but holy. Thus the town, quick to condemn, grew quick to reshape memory. In the days that followed, Rowan cared for March with a devotion that burned away his grief's husk. He rubbed salve into scars, fed him oats from his own bowl, walked him at dawn through fields where frost still clung. The horse, cautious at first, grew to trust the boy's voice as compass and anchor. Where once he startled at every shadow, now he breathed steady when Rowan's hand lay on his neck. Where once he flinched from rope, now he lowered his head to halter as if offering it himself. Yet not all wounds close clean. At night, March still woke in sweats, hooves striking straw, eyes wide with ghosts. Rowan would rise from his cot, lock it warm against his chest, and stand by until the storm within the beast had passed. "Easy," he would whisper, same as always. "Easy, March." And though the horse could not speak, he would press his nose into the boy's shoulder, breath hot, as if to say, "I remember. I remain." The magistrate, seeing boy and beast bound by quiet covenant, ceased his threats. The crowd, fickle as reeds in wind, began to speak of Rowan as the lad with the storm horse. Some even bowed their heads when March passed, though whether in awe or superstition none could tell. Only Hawk kept his silence, his eyes sharp from shadow. Rowan, for all the newfound regard, did not boast. He spent his days in labor, his nights in tending, his heart both lighter and heavier. For in March's dark gaze he sometimes glimpsed fragments, not of monster, not even of horse alone, but of history. What hands had once braided the thread in his forelock? What voice had first named him Morrow's March? And what fate had torn him from that past into chains and scorn? Thus the boy's heart, once hollow, now ached with a different hunger, to uncover the truth that had been branded into March's hide. Spring crept, slow but sure. Grass greened, fences mended, and the sky shed its winter gloom. Rowan led March into pastures wide, where daisies nodded and skylarks rose. No crowd followed now. The miracle had settled into story, the story into rumor, the rumor into silence. But for Rowan, the miracle was each morning's breath beside him, each step that shook no chain, one dawn. As mist curled like parchment across the fields, Rowan clasped his locket, the one token of the man with the bread-warm laugh. He opened it, gaze steady. Within, worn by time, lay the sketch of a crest and the same as March's brand, the letter M with arrow entwined. Tears blurred the lines, but the truth shone clearer than sun. March lifted his head, ears pricked, as if he too saw. Rowan pressed the locket to the horse's brow upon the very place where his palm had first touched. "Thou wert his," Rowan whispered, voice breaking. "And now thou art mine, not by chain, but by choice." March blew a warm breath, nostrils soft against the boy's cheek, and then, in a gesture subtle yet vast, stepped ahead, leading. For the first time, Rowan did not pull but followed. Across meadow and brook, into the hush of dawn, horse before boy, boy before world. It was no act of submission, but of union. And in that walk, Rowan's grief, once a hollow stone, cracked and filled with water. Not all loss can be mended, but some can be carried by two where one alone would stumble. He felt his father's hand in the weight of reins unneeded. His father's laugh in the thunder of hooves that no longer ran from fear but toward horizon. The town would forget the storm's details, as towns always do. But Rowan would never forget the sound of chains falling, nor the warmth of breath that chose him. And when strangers asked, was he truly a monster? Rowan would smile, faint as dawn, and answer, nay, only a soul waiting for a hand to remember him. Thus ends the tale, not in spectacle, but in peace. A boy with a hollow heart, a horse with a scarred hide, each touching the other into wholeness, and the last words the wind carried. As if Shakespeare himself had leaned upon the sky, were these: "Monsters are but mirrors, and love the light that breaks them. If this story touch thy soul, let not the moment fade. Subscribe, comment, and press the bell, that thou mayest walk with us again when the next tale rides into the dusk, or in the tongue of old. If thy spirit was stirred, subscribe and ring yon bell, that thou mayst join anon for stories untold, where beasts and boys alike find their names again."